I want to share just a little bit of information about the neuroscience that is involved with mindful leadership. You know, mindful leadership skills aren't necessarily new, but more recently, especially over the last 5 to 10 years, there's been an incredible amount of research on the brain that really shows the effects that mindful leadership skills have that can help you become a better leader. So I just wanted to share a little bit of that with you because, you know, in the old days, I'm going to sound my age a little bit now, but, you know, the expectation of you as a boss was just get results. That's really what mattered. And today it's more about getting results, and we've got to be able to focus on the development of our employees and making sure that they've always got the kind of opportunities to grow and into their roles and be candidates for advancement if that's something that they want to do. The expectation is that we become more transparent as leaders, that we share more information with our colleagues, that we become vulnerable about the things that we don't necessarily do very well and how we're trying to improve. We're expected to be more flexible. It's not, you know, my way or the highway just doesn't work anymore. Not that it ever really worked, but we've got to become more flexible. You know, we're charged with improving employee satisfaction, and that's becoming obviously a bigger and bigger thing. Today you can have as many as maybe 4 or 5, even 6 generations of people who are working for you. And so how you lead millennials versus baby boomers is very, very different. And so part of being a leader today is understanding those differences. We are also expected to involve our employees in the change management processes that go on all the time and getting their input into things and keeping them informed as decisions are being made. Very different from the old days. You know, understanding that work can mean different things to different people. You may have a team of people that you're leading. One member of the team may be coming to work simply for a paycheck. Another member of the same team views work as their life. It's their passion. It's their all-consuming goal. And so how do you have those two people work successfully and collaborate with each other? That's something that leaders are expected to understand and know how to work with. And knowing that in the long run, it's just better to develop people and make them better and happier in their roles. And the economic side of that, frankly, is that it's cheaper. And we've all seen lots of numbers thrown around about how much it costs to replace somebody. And the unknown is usually not as good as the known. And so we're expected to have the ability to develop folks and help them be successful. So to do all that, you know, what does this have to do with neurology in the brain, right? So in order to do all that, we've got to use kind of a different part of the brain, or use our brains differently than maybe we did in the past. You know, like I said, now we've got to be focused on the complexity of the individuals that we're working with, and not only, you know, like I talked about before, the generational stuff as an example, or why they work, paycheck versus passion kind of thing. But we also have to be aware that those things vary from day to day. And, you know, one day somebody may feel like they're just there for a paycheck, and the next day they're all, you know, they're all excited about the actual work. So we've got to be able to stay on top of those kinds of things. And so our brains become more of I guess, a social organ, if you will. And we've got to tap into that and understand how to grow that a little bit more. Because, you know, today our stress levels are higher than they've probably ever been. And I don't think that our ability to manage our emotions has necessarily kept pace with all of the expectations that we have as leaders. So mindful leadership skills are incredibly important to help us manage the stress that we as individuals have, but also the members of our team. So mindful leadership skills, there's a lot of research around that, and the neurology of kind of the social part of the brain. And for those of you that are Daniel Goleman fans like me, you're going to recognize that a lot of what we're talking about here are the components of emotional intelligence. You know, the kind of the social awareness piece, or the, you know, the self-awareness component, the self-regulation stuff. You'll see what I mean as I kind of go through some of the neurological pieces that we want to work with. You know, I saw a quote not too long ago from a guy. He's a neurologist, actually, but he was also the facilitator at a recent neuro leadership summit. His name's Paul McDonald, Dr. Paul McDonald. And the quote was that brain development is the same as leadership development. And I thought that was really good because as we practice and learn mindful leadership skills, we're able to develop these areas of the brain that are responsible for the characteristics that we want to have as leaders that I was mentioning earlier. Okay, so there are different brain triggers that actually affect our ability to do our best work. You know, the brain, as we know, is a very complicated organ, and it reacts to social situations in basically the same way that it reacts to the physical environment. So we've all heard about fight or flight, right? So, you know, you're walking through the woods and a bear shows up, and automatically our brains go to, do I stand here and fight, or do I run? And by the way, don't ever run. As I used to tell my kids when they were little, a bear will always eat you. But anyway, that fight or flight piece is critical, and it's you know, years and years and millenniums of conditioning, social conditioning, has wired that into our brains. Well, we also have a fight or flight reaction in social situations. So when we have a social threat that presents to our brain in the same way that a physical threat would, it triggers the same kind of reaction. So let me give you an example. Let's say that you are doing an evaluation of a direct report's performance, and they start to challenge you on some of the things that you're saying. You're going to have some emotions in that moment, right? As a leader, so you're hoping that when you go into that situation that you're just going to be able to go through the evaluation. The employee's going to say, okay, I'll keep doing these things well, and I'll try to do these things better, and everybody signs off and life is good. However, we also know that in many situations, the employee is going to challenge you. So what happens in the brain is that there are certain emotions that are triggered when you're challenged in that kind of a scenario. And in this case, probably the most common ones would be anger, you know, how dare you question me, or we've talked about these things all year, I can't believe you're picking now to, you know, challenge me on this stuff, or fear, frankly. And fear may seem like an odd emotion to feel when an employee challenges you, but I mean, I can tell stories from my past. I was a vice president of operations for a large nursing facility company, and I had a facility in Atlanta, Georgia, and the woman that ran that place was having a similar conversation with one of her employees. It was actually the director of maintenance, and he literally lunged across the desk with a drill gun to attack her. So she was okay. Let me first say that that situation was handled. But you know, I would imagine that going forward, if somebody challenged her in that kind of a situation, even if it wasn't with a drill gun, her normal reaction would be fear, understandably so, right? So what happens is in our brains that, we have these reactions that are triggered by the limbic system of our brain, and it has a negative impact on how we handle that situation. So the limbic system, what is that? Without getting into a lot of detail, the two critical areas of the limbic system, at least as far as this conversation is concerned, are the hippocampus, which is primarily responsible for memory, and the amygdala, which, even though it's very small, plays a very big role in the brain, and it primarily is responsible for how to process these emotions. So when we feel anger or when we feel fear, those are that's the part of the brain that really takes that emotion and figures out what to do with it. So immediately that it goes into this fight or flight response. And what happens in our bodies is we all of a sudden, and you probably remember this from discussions about fight or flight from the past, all of a sudden we've got fewer resources available to our brain, primarily what's called our prefrontal cortex, which is at the front of our brains, and that's where conscious thought occurs. And so what I mean by fewer resources is not as much oxygen gets to that part of the brain, there's not as much glucose, and so what does that mean? So you've got this employee that's challenging you, you go into this kind of social fight or flight, all of a sudden you've got fewer resources available to you to try to figure out what the right response is to this person. And so this threat response is activated, and we've learned through the research that we start to lose a little bit of our ability to understand what's going on in that moment. We lose a little bit of the ability to make decisions or make good decisions. All of a sudden, and this may sound familiar, let's say you're reaching for an example of the kind of thing that you're going over with this employee about, and you can't remember anything, right? You can't remember an example of when they demonstrated this problem with their productivity or their quality of service or whatever the case may be. So our memories suffer a little bit. We lose a little bit of the ability to control our impulses. So that's why if somebody starts yelling at us, we're more likely to yell right back at them. That's the kind of the normal automated thing that happens in a social fight or flight situation. In general, we struggle to solve problems and communicate. The other part of it too, just in general, not specifically with that example, is we also become less able to be creative and innovative, and we struggle to see the big picture, and we know that as leaders that's really critical, because it's the creativity and the innovation that drives companies to be the leaders in the marketplace, right? That's the piece that takes a company and makes it more than just a production effort. Leaders are expected to have this vision of the future, and so if we're struggling with handling kind of the social aspects of our role, we're not going to be able to lead our companies or our teams forward in the same way. So I'm going to talk to you about 3 specific things in our brains that a couple of them you probably haven't heard of. The third one you probably have, but just how does all this work in terms of mindful leadership skills? What can we improve at doing as leaders if we can develop these mindful leadership skills? What the research shows is that we practice mindfulness, our brains literally become thicker, and it strengthens the connections between our brain cells. So having a thick brain is a good thing. And mindfulness also can produce real lasting improvements in the area of the brain that's responsible for processing emotions as well. We've got this cerebral cortex, which is kind of that outer layer of the, the neural tissue that's around the brain, and it's, it's responsible for memory and attention and consciousness, all obviously pretty critical roles in our day-to-day lives. And one of the most key findings in the last few years is the degree to which that cerebral cortex is flexible, and it's referred to as the neuroplasticity of the cerebral cortex. So it allows our brains to grow, actually, and that's really what we're talking about. So the first piece that I wanted to share has to, the word is gyrification. And what gyrification is, I don't know why I think of, if you're old enough, you remember spirograph. You'd have that piece of paper and you put your pen in the little circle things and you draw these very cool, it's very big in the 60s and 70s. But anyway, gyrification, not spirograph. Gyrification is that process where our cerebral cortex changes and it creates, when you've seen pictures of the brain, you see all those folds and those furrows in the brain. Gyrification is the process by which our cerebral cortexes create those, actually creates a thicker brain. And we know from the neuroplasticity piece that we've got room to grow that, to create more folds and furrows in our brain. And so what does this do? Why is that important? Well, it improves our ability to process information, to make decisions, to form memories, all the kinds of things that I was talking about when we were talking about the example of dealing with a situation of an employee challenging us. We've got to be able to process information in that moment. We've got to be able to make decisions on how we're going to handle that, and we've got to be able to dig for memories and form new ones in that situation. So what the research has shown is that people who routinely practice these mindful leadership skills have heightened levels of gyrification. They form these new folds and furrows in their brains. In fact, the longer someone practices these mindful leadership skills, so if you keep doing this for years going forward, the greater that correlation is between practicing mindful leadership skills and the amount of this kind of insular gyrification. So, at the end of the day, people who are regular practitioners of mindful leadership are able to demonstrate greater introspection, pretty critical trait to have, and awareness, and really importantly, better emotional control, and going back to the components of emotional intelligence, better self-regulation. Additionally, it shows that we're able to show more compassion towards other people. The more mindful we are, we show more compassion to people, which is a much better response to someone who is challenging us than yelling at them or getting angry with them. It's beneficial for us too. It keeps us in a good place. Again, more research on that. People who consistently practice mindful leadership skills increase their compassionate behavior by a factor of 2. I mean, that's pretty big. And that just proves that altruism is a learned behavior, right? It's not just feeling more compassionate towards people, but it's actually acting on those feelings. You don't feel overwhelmed, but you feel this compassion towards somebody, and you do something about it. You try to help them out. It's a much better response to somebody who's challenging you to show them compassion. Boy, I can tell you're really stressed out about this, and I really want to, let's work through this together. I want to let's get to a place where you're going to feel better about how to work on this situation going forward. You know, much better response to the example that I was sharing earlier than reacting with anger or kind of losing some of that impulse control that happens with that social fight or flight situation. Okay, the second one that I wanted to share with you is something called telomeres. Telomeres are pieces of DNA at the ends of our chromosomes, and they're like helmets kind of on the ends of our chromosomes, and they protect us from stress. That's one of their critical jobs. And as we get older, these telomeres start to wear down. They get frayed, and we become less able to kind of ward off the damaging effects of stress. And so, like things like our immune systems get weaker, we get sick faster, our blood pressure goes up, we become more likely to contract a chronic disease, pain gets worse, more likely to become depressed or anxious. What mindful leadership skills do, again, if we continue to practice them, is that they actually increase telomere activity. So when we utilize mindful habits in our everyday lives, there are enzymes that actually rebuild and lengthen those telomeres. So it's not just stopping the decay of the telomeres, we actually have the ability to rebuild them and lengthen them to protect us from further stress. In fact, there are researchers that believe that this could actually help people extend their lifespans, because we know what the damaging effects of stress are. If we actually can practice mindful leadership skills and do it consistently and over a long period of time, we're less likely to deal with the effects of things like, or have to deal with the effects of things like high blood pressure or chronic disease and so on. Very, very interesting stuff. The third one that many of you, I'm sure, have heard about is cortisol. So cortisol is the stress hormone that we all have, and the research shows that practicing mindful leadership, you probably know where I'm going with this, practicing mindful leadership skills actually reduces cortisol levels, and it increases the brain's gray matter, okay? And that's associated with attention and memory, emotions, decision-making, self-control, empathy, you know, all the things that are really critical to being a successful leader. So the more we can reduce our cortisol levels, the better a leader. And going back to all those things that I mentioned at the beginning, that things that we're expected to do as a leader today that we weren't necessarily expected to do 30 years ago, that's what this all works on. So what actually happens is that it doesn't mean that we're immune to stress, doesn't mean that we're not going to feel angry, it doesn't mean that we're not going to be fearful in some situations. But what it does mean is that we become better able to recover faster, to choose to respond rather than react in stressful situations. And being able to recover faster is a sign of a good leader, right? Everybody gets angry now and again, but to be able to, you know, kind of deal with that and move forward makes a big difference. I'm going to go down a small path here just for a second, because I would imagine that some of you who are watching this right now are saying, you know, okay, so this mindfulness stuff sounds good, you know, developing these mindful leadership skills, you know, that may be worth it, but, you know, I do other things to manage my stress, you know, it's probably not good for me, but, you know, I found out a long time ago that if I find myself in a stressful situation, really I just go outside and I have a cigarette and I'm fine. Or, some of us will eat, right? Go get a Snickers bar. There's a whole commercial campaign about how just have a Snickers bar and you'll relax, right? Some find that, I don't know, shoe shopping helps people manage their stress. But it really doesn't, seriously, it does not replace mindfulness. And it actually can be bad for you. And let me explain why. Obviously, we know why smoking is bad for you. I certainly don't need to go there. But whether it's looking forward to having the next cigarette or the next Snickers bar or the next shopping excursion with your friends, those tend to actually intensify stress because they create this negative feedback loop. So when you're feeling negative emotions, when you would normally reach for that Snickers bar as an example, you start craving that, right? Every time that you feel the stress, you start craving the Snickers bar. You crave going shopping. You crave having a cigarette. And every time that happens, you reward yourself with the Snickers bar or the cigarette or whatever. And so it's positive reinforcement for you. And it intensifies over time. And actually what happens is you become less happy and more stressed than before. And the frequency, a lot of people who are under a lot of stress find themselves eating a lot more, smoking a lot more if they're smokers, as examples. And so that substitute, whatever that might be, if you go outside and have a cigarette, that may quiet your mind temporarily, but the craving is still there. It doesn't go away. And while you're having that cigarette, that craving doesn't go away. It just makes you happy in that moment. But the time in between those cravings, it gets more intense, and suddenly you're going outside more frequently, or you're smoking more, or whatever. So, Erik, but what about, eating Snickers bars and smoking? That's not healthy, right? But so what happens if you have a healthy snack, or you go for a walk or something like that, and that's the way you manage stress? Okay, and that's certainly better than having a cigarette, but you got to know that the negative loop is still there, right? It's still working on you, and you still need to you still find yourself needing to get away from those emotions, to not deal with the emotions, but escape from those emotions. What mindfulness leadership skills do for you is they allow you to kind of ride out that stress. And ride out that craving, and instead of escaping it by having a Snickers bar, and I'm not dissing Snickers bars. I love Snickers bars, for the record. But what mindfulness allows you to do is to instead of turning and running away from the emotion, it encourages you to turn and face the emotion and accept the fact that you're stressed. And then figuring out how to handle the emotions that are coming up with that stress, the anger or the fear, and making good choices about that, making decisions about how to respond in that present moment, which is really what mindfulness is about. It's paying attention to the present moment purposely, right? You purposely are going to say, I'm not going to run outside and have a cigarette. I'm not going to reach for that Snickers bar. I'm going to look at my stress here. I'm going to look at this anger that I'm feeling in the moment right now, and I'm going to figure out how to best respond to it. And the more we practice these mindfulness leadership skills that we teach at Mindful Solutions, the sooner that becomes just an automated response, and that's where that growing of the brain comes from, right? That's where the folds start to grow. And so the research shows that literally you start to change your mind. Pretty cool, right? You actually have the ability to change the chemistry of your brain over time. Change the way that we're originally wired so that you make better decisions as a leader going forward. Okay. One last point I want to make. And this is more from I guess, a 30,000 foot level, if you will. The research shows that when we practice mindful leadership skills, there's less activity in the part of the brain that is responsible for thoughts about the self, kind of the me part of the brain. It's actually the medial prefrontal cortex. Okay, that's the part of the brain that is concerned about the self, about me. And what we find is that there's less activity when we practice mindfulness in that part of the brain. And the researchers at Penn actually found that people who are really skilled with these mindfulness skills they actually focus less on the self, on the me, and they really see it. They stop seeing the self as a distinct entity, and they start to see a connection between the external world and the me. So instead of it's me against the world, it becomes me and the world, which is a healthier way to look at how you interact in your job, in your life, rather than a more protective, separatist, it's all about me kind of situation. So you can understand a little bit better that to practice these mindful leadership skills, it takes you away from kind of the more selfish end of the continuum that we have. So at Mindful Solutions, we have workshops and webinars that deal with these kinds of things to help you literally change your mind and help you deal with some of these fears and anxieties that you have, and help you work on the kinds of skills and traits that today's leaders are looking at, that we can literally work on changing the way our brains operate. It's very exciting stuff to know that we're not hardwired and we can't be changed. We do have that ability, and it's up to us, and we've got to work on it and practice it, and Mindful Solutions will give you the tools to help you do so. And I hope that you'll check out what we've got available for you on our store page, and start taking advantage of them so that you can become more productive and effective for your organization.